It is a real opportunity to speak with American citizens who seriously seek to remove racial and religious intolerance from our national life. For recent history amply reveals that America cannot gain moral leadership in the world unless intolerance of minority groups has been eliminated at home. The journey of reconciliation was organized not only to devise techniques for eliminating Jim Crow in travel, but also as a training ground for similar peaceful projects against discrimination in such major areas as employment and in the armed forces. The use of these methods against Jim Crow military service is a regrettable necessity. Today, no single injustice more bitterly stands out in the hearts and minds of colored people the world over, or continues more successfully to frustrate the United States efforts abroad than the continuation of discrimination and segregation in our military forces. As a follower of the principles of Mahatma Gandhi, I am an opponent of war and of war preparations, and an opponent of universal military training and conscription. But entirely apart from that issue, I hold that segregation in any part of the body politic is an act of slavery and an act of war. Democrats will agree that such acts are to be resisted, and more leaders of the oppressed are responsibly proposing nonviolent civil disobedience and non-cooperation as the means. On March 22nd, 1948, A. Philip Randolph and Grant Reynolds trusted Negro leaders told President Truman that Negroes do not propose to shoulder another gun for democracy abroad while they are denied democracy here at home. A few days later, when Mr. Randolph testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, he declared that he openly would advise and urge Negro and white youth not to submit to Jim Crow military institutions. At this statement, Senator Wayne Morse interrupted and warned Mr. Randolph that the government would apply the legal doctrine of treason to such conduct. This is a highly regrettable statement for a United States senator to make. Certainly throughout Asia and Africa, millions must have agreed that the lovers of freedom here, who reason that if treason is involved, it is the treason practiced by reactionaries in the North and South who struggle to maintain segregation and discrimination and who thus murder the American creed. The organizations and perpetuators of segregation are as much the enemy of America as any foreign invader. The time has come when they are not merely to be protested. They must be resisted. The world and the United States should know that there are many younger leaders, both Black and white, in positions of responsibility who, not wishing to see democracy destroyed from within, will support Mr. Randolph and Mr. Reynolds. We know that men should not and will not fight to perpetuate for themselves caste and second-class citizenship. We know that men cannot struggle for someone else's freedom in the same battle in which they fasten semi-slavery more securely upon themselves. Well, there is a very real question. Whether any army can bring freedom, certainly a Jim Crow army cannot. On the contrary, to those it attempts to liberate, it will bring discrimination and segregation, such as we are now exporting to Europe and to South America. To subject young men at their most impressionable age to be forced caste system, as now outlined in the Universal Military Training and Selective Services Bill, is not only democratic, but will prove to be suicidal. Segregation in the military must be resisted if democracy and peace are to survive. Thus, civil disobedience against caste is not merely a right, but a profound duty. If carried out in the spirit of goodwill and nonviolence, it will prick the conscience of America as Gandhi's campaigns stirred the hearts of men the world over. Therefore, in the future, I shall join with others to advise and urge Negroes and white people not to betray the American ideal by accepting Jim Crow in any of our institutions, including the armed forces. Further, I have noticed of the government that to the extent of my resources, I shall assist in the organization of disciplined cells across the nation to advise resistance and to provide spiritual, financial, and legal aid to resistors. If Senator Morse and the government believe that intimidation, repression, prison, or even death can stop such a movement, let them examine past struggles for freedom. If the government continues to consider such action treason, let it recall the advice that Justice Jackson gave the German people at the opening of the Nuremberg trials. Men, he said, are individually responsible for their acts and are not to be excused for following unjust demands made upon them by governments. Failure of the German citizens to resist anti-social laws from the beginning of the Hitler regime logically ended in their placing Jews in gas furnaces and lye pits. Justice Jackson indicated in conclusion that individual resistance to undemocratic laws would have been a large factor in destroying the unjust Nazi state. I believe that American citizens would do well to ponder Mr. Jackson's remarks. Civil disobedience is urged not to destroy the United States, but because the government is now poorly organized to achieve democracy. The aim of such a movement always will be to improve the nature of the government. The urgent counsel resistance to military Jim Crow in the interest of a higher law, the principle of equality and justice upon which real community and security depend. I sincerely hope that millions of Negroes and white people who cherish freedom will pledge themselves now to resist Jim Crow everywhere, including the military establishments. Thereby, the United States may in part achieve the moral leadership in world affairs for which we so vigorously strive. I urge you to register this intention now with your senators and your congressmen. It is my supreme desire that those who resist will do so in that spirit, which is without hatred, bitterness, or contention. I trust that all resistors will hold firm to the true faith that only goodwill resistance in the end is capable of overwhelming injustice. They are trusted. Major strategists for the civil rights movement. Advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King, March 1948.
Turn me round, Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land, marching up to freedom land, marching up to freedom land.
The Selma to Montgomery marches were three protest marches held in 1965 along the 54th Highway from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. The marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African-American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote in defiance of segregationist repression. They were part of a broader voting rights movement underway in Selma and throughout the American South. By highlighting racial injustice, they contributed to passage that year Voting Rights Act, a landmark federal achievement of the civil rights movement. Southern state legislatures had passed and maintained a series of discriminatory requirements and practices that had disenfranchised most of the millions of African Americans across the South throughout the 20th century. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, brought many prominent civil rights and civic leaders to Selma in January 1965. On February 26, 1965, activist and deacon Jimmy Lee Jackson died after being shot several days earlier by State Trooper James Bernard Fowler during a peaceful march in nearby Marion, Alabama. To diffuse and refocus the community's outrage, James Bevel, who was directing SCLC's Selma voting rights movement, called for a march of dramatic length from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. The first march took place on March 7, 1965, organized locally by Bevel, Amelia Boynton, and others. State troopers and county posse men attacked the unarmed marchers with billy clubs and tear gas after they passed over the country line. And the event became known as Bloody Sunday. Law enforcement beat Boynton unconscious, and the media publicized worldwide a picture of her lying wounded on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The second march took place on March the 9th. Troopers, police, and marchers confronted each other at the county end of the bridge. But when the troopers stepped aside to let them pass, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the marchers back to the church. He was obeying a federal injunction while seeking protection from federal court for the march. That night, a white group beat and murdered civil rights activist James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, who had come to Selma to march with the second group. With Governor Wallace refusing to protect the marchers, President Lyndon Johnson committed to do so. The third march started on March 21st. The marchers averaged 10 miles a day along United States Route 80, known in Alabama as the Jefferson Davis Highway. The marchers arrived in Montgomery on March 24th and at the Alabama State Capitol on March 25th.